The programme today, we've got a number of short presentations, 10 to 15 minutes or so each, with question time after each one. And they'll be covering our approach to invasive plant control and our tactics with individual species. Mark Perlman Charles, the project officer from TNS, will open the batting. Then Karen Muller from Devon will talk about balsam and hogweed and our sheep volunteers. I'll pick it up after that to cover mink control on the scale that we're working on, and Vicky Hilton, our volunteer and communications officer, will be talking about our volunteering programmes and the fantastic contribution they make to the project. And there will be question time and discussion time if we want it at the end of all that, if you've still got the will to carry on after the presentations. Somewhat again about the project. We appreciate many people here will know quite a lot about it already, but some may not. The scheme's a 4-year programme, 2017 to 2021. We are scheduled to finish this October, but there's a likely extension to October 2022, and we're planning on that basis already. And we're working at, in Scottish terms anyway, a big scale. So it's across about a third of mainland Scotland, from Perth north and across to the west coast and the Kyle of Sutherland and West Sutherland and West of Ross. And the whole ethos of the project is to work with partners locally and to work with and engage people and community groups with us to support the programme and for us to support them. We have a cluster of partners in this scheme. Clearly, a project such as this can't happen on its own. It needs other people to help support it. So the programme partners are set out there for you. A number of fisheries and rivers boards and trusts, academic partner University of Aberdeen, and the funding partners National Loyalty Heritage Fund, who are putting the majority of the cash on the table, alongside Nature Scot, which is the artist formerly known as Scottish Natural Heritage. So we have a total cash value of just over 2 million, and in-kind support from volunteers and the partners themselves, giving a total value of 3.34 million. And it generally is a collaborative effort with those partners, their staff, and a small band of a project dedicated team. We have 3 streams of activity in the project, and we're going to cover all of those this afternoon. American mink control, which I'll pick up later on, invasive plant control, and then the bedstone or cornerstone of the whole programme is education and awareness and our work with volunteers. So we're going to work through those each today, give you a chance to see what we do, how we do it, ask us questions, challenge us, and gives us a chance to share the progress that we've made in the first 2 or 3 years of the scheme. So we again thank you at the beginning for coming along today and for taking the time out your day to share some time with us. We hope you enjoy this. If you don't, then let us know. If you do, then we'd be really pleased to hear about that too, so we can figure out how best we might repeat it if we dare to repeat it. So I think rather than waste time with me waffling on about the project in general terms, the next presenter is Mark Perlman Charles. He's going to talk us about tactics for invasive plant control and individual species.
Lovely, good. Well, yes, thank you, Callum. Like you mentioned, I'm the project officer for the Tay and Essex region, and I'm going to talk to you today sort of about how to approach something like an invasive non-native plant problem and how to actually start going about dealing with the problem and planning and organising yourself so that you're not wasting time and energy and effort, and you're doing it in a nice and coordinated and organised way. And then I'll also talk about some specific species that we're dealing with, Japanese knotweed and American skunk cabbage in my case, and then Karen will carry on with the other ones. Obviously today I'm going to be using examples of riparian areas, rivers, watercourses, but a lot of what I'll be talking about today is broadly applicable to other scenarios too. It's just obviously we're a riparian project, so those are the examples I'm going to be giving. So we'll just jump right into it. And obviously, so you've got invasive non-native plants on your river. what you do. The temptation is just sort of go charging in and crashing around and doing things and hoping for the best, but that's not the way you want to be doing things. Firstly, you don't want to panic, because people see an invasive non-native species problem and they think, oh my God, it looks awful. And they panic and they make poor decisions, and then things get disorganized and actually probably sometimes end up being worse than when they started. So we're going to go through right now what to do and how to do it in a nice and controlled and organized way so that no one's panicking and everyone's organized. So we're going to talk about understanding your species. We're going to be talking about identifying the best control method to use, because there are, with different plant species, a variety of control methods you can use, but some are more effective than others, and some, in some cases, you should just stay away from completely. And then we're going to talk about understanding the context of your location, how to take action, and then also you've taken action, excellent, but then we need to monitor and review every year as you go forward, because taking action one year, in almost all cases, will not solve the problem for you. So we're going to talk about all that. So first off, understand your species. Obviously, what is it? We need to understand what species we're dealing with, because each species spreads differently, grows at different times, behaves in different ways, can even grow in different areas. So if you don't know what you're dealing with, that's a complete non-starter. So the first thing to do is understand what is it. And then once you've understand what it is, you can then look at, well, how does it spread? How does it grow? Is it an annual? Is it perennial? In the case of something like giant hogweed, actually, if you catch it early, it doesn't seed for 3 years. So you've got a situation where you could even nip it in the bud before it even becomes a problem. All these sorts of things. And then if it's a well-established problem, how many years of control will it take to control this? Because if you're only going to do 2 years of control and it's a 5-year problem, then you're wasting your time. So those are the things you need to start thinking about immediately once you've identified the species that you're dealing with. Also, where else is it growing? You might see it on your stretch of river, but rivers are connected. So you need to look upstream, you need to look downstream, you need to understand, right, what is the extent of the problem that we're dealing with here? Is it a localized problem? In which case, fantastic. But if it's not, where's it come from? Where is it going? How far is it spread? These are important things to know, and we'll go into a bit more in that in a minute. And then what time of year does it grow? And what's the optimal treatment time? Because if you don't know these things, chances are you're not only going to miss optimal control, but if you do control, then you potentially waste your time and energy doing something that's not very effective. And in some cases, some of the control methods do have a cost implication as well as a time implication. So you're also then wasting money in that case, which is a real shame, because we don't want to waste money. So identifying the most effective control method, the best place we would sort of signpost you to go to is the NNSS, GB Non-Native Species Secretariat. It's an excellent website. There's all sorts of fantastic resources on there, ID sheets, control outlines, general information, lots and lots. There's a photo library. So if you've got something you're not sure of, you can go on there and look at the photo library and maybe get an understanding of what you're dealing with before you look at the ID sheets and that sort of thing. So that is where we'd signpost you. Obviously, our website, we've got some information on there, but this is sort of the central location where everything usually is that you need to identify and understand what it is you might be dealing with. Then with control methods, obviously there's a variety of control methods. You've got manual control, you've got chemical control. Each one come with their own pros and cons, and you have to understand the most effective one might have, say in the example of chemical control, there may be cost implications with that, because you might have to get qualifications. There might be legal requirements for paperwork you have to fill out, and you have to purchase special equipment and PPE. In other cases, it might just be, well, we can just take a couple of shovels and go dig this thing up. So you have to consider these things, because if you're trying to undertake control, you need to understand what level of money and effort do we have, and what control options are there. And you want to try and match those up as best you can, so that you're realistic in what you can achieve and that you don't end up biting off more than you can chew. Understand a location and survey. So obviously it's great you found some hogweed. I get this all the time. Oh, there's hogweed in Perth. Fantastic. I know there's hogweed in Perth. However, there's also hogweed in Aberfeldy. So you have to find the upstream source. You have to work out where it's come from, because things wash downstream. So if you're controlling in Perth, the situation might improve in the short term, but in the long term, millions of seeds are washing down from Aberfeldy, where we should be doing the control, and in our case where we are doing the control, because that's your source, that's where it's all come from. And if you don't deal with that, it doesn't matter what you're doing downstream. So finding the original source is absolutely vital, and that may take some time, but it's a very vital thing to do. And I would say it's actually the more important thing to do than just rushing in and starting to do control where you know it already is. So start upstream, identify your upstream locations, and work down. We recommend treatment on a catchment scale, and that requires working very, very closely with your neighbours, with other land managers, coordinating. That's the whole point of SISI. That's the model we find is very successful. But it's not just us, that is the successful way of doing it. Because if you're controlling downstream and say your upstream neighbours have it on their land and aren't controlling, then you're wasting your time. So it's best to be collaborative, get everyone on board and working together. Here's just a quick example, just to put what I've just said into a visual element for you. So we've got a hypothetical river here with our Japanese knotweed and our giant hogweed. Now, how would we control this river? Would we start with the Japanese knotweed or the giant hogweed first? Well, if we check and we had a look, we know that giant hogweed spreads by seed, whereas Japanese knotweed spreads by rhizome and vegetatively. So I would actually say it's the giant hogweed you want to control first. If you've got limited time and money available to you, control the thing that is more likely to get out of control quickly, and that's the thing that can seed. So I would then say control the giant hogweed. And then when you've dealt with the giant hogweed, the Japanese knotweed would be the next thing to control, but that spreads much slower as long as it's not being treated incorrectly. They also grow at different times of year, so you might be able to combine both in one year, but again, it's all about knowing what you can actually achieve. So in this case, would we start down here in the black area? No, you wouldn't. You'd have to find the upstream source, in which case that's the red. So we'd control the red area. If we were doing both, we control our giant hogweed and our Japanese knotweed. And when we knew these areas were under control, we would then check, right, are there any tributaries on our main river? And if there are, say it's halfway up the catchment, we need to check these tributaries, because as we can see here, there's some hogweed here as well. So if we start treating the green, we're wasting our time because there is the yellow here. So we then need to make sure that any upstream tributaries are also under management and control. Then we can slowly, systematically work our way downstream in a collaborative and organized fashion. And obviously, if you're concentrating on certain species, do the hogweed first, then the Japanese knotweed in this scenario. Or if you're able to do them both within the same year over multiple years, then you'd work your way down with both species together. Now, once you've done all this excellent control, it doesn't just go away. In many cases, these species have seed banks that you need to be aware of, and rhizomes which store energy so that these plants will grow back. So once you've done your control, you must monitor and review your sites. You need to be going back and checking on an annual basis and then redoing control for anything that's coming up more. In the example of giant hogweed, it can take multiple years, up to 7, maybe more, because of the seed bank that's established on the riverbank. If you leave that, you then end up back to square one after a couple of years, and maybe the 1 or 2 years work of time and energy and money you put in is completely wasted already. So you have to make sure that you're really careful and you're checking these sites and you're reapplying control when the situation demands it. And it can trick you. Areas can improve massively, really, really quickly. And you think, oh, this is brilliant. We've knocked it in 2 years. And actually, everyone gives up and goes home and goes, brilliant, well done. 2 years down the line, everything's back to how it was. So this is almost as important as the control itself, is actually following up and making sure that you're doing this properly and actually looking at what's going on and seeing how your sites are improving over time. Main points to remember then: understand what you're dealing with, find the source and plan a strategy, identify your control methods, ensure you have, if you're doing chemical control, stuff like that, the necessary permission, qualifications. Coordinate with the people around you. That's absolutely vital. And multiple years of treatment is likely and more often than not completely required. And then obviously practice good biosecurity. Don't spread the problem around yourself. Don't spread hogweed seeds around when you're controlling hogweed, that sort of thing. Don't be part of the problem, be the solution. So we're just going to quickly go through some example species. So one of the ones we control is Japanese knotweed. It was brought in from Japan and East Asia by the Victorians. And it escaped pretty quickly from ornamental gardens and that sort of stuff. spreads by rhizome and plant fragments in the UK, and tends to do very well on any disturbed ground that you can find, so riverbanks, railways, roadsides. You see it a lot in urban areas and sort of wasteland too. If you're interested, obviously, we've got more information on our website, but then there's also the Invasive Species Secretariat too, where you can go and have a look. So what are the impacts? Why is it a problem? Well, it essentially, as you can see from our pictures here, it completely crowds out a ecosystem and not only outcompetes everything and degrades biodiversity, but in the case of riverbanks, actually exacerbates problems like erosion and that sort of stuff. So it has huge impacts. There's also economic impacts in terms of controlling it, and then also the damage it can do in an urban environment. And that's due to the sort of rhizomes actually cracking foundations and these sorts of things. So there's an environmental impact, there's a visual impact, and there's also an economic impact to these things. And once it's taken over an ecosystem, the ecosystem does sort of alter permanently. How do we control it? So Japanese knotweed, we control through stem injection. These are these lovely little stem injectors right here. They're called the no-mix stem injector. They're not too expensive and really effective. We find they're the best thing to use. We try and inject up to 60% of the stems for the best result. We're currently using glyphosate, but that's injected directly into the stems between the second and third, or first and second nodes. Japanese knotweed grows in nodes, so if you get it between those points, that's the best area to get them. Optimal treatments late July to September, and it's always important to mark the stems, because if you've injected 1,000 stems and you haven't marked them, then you've got no idea what you've injected and what you haven't, and you end up re-injecting things multiple times, which is obviously a waste of everybody's time. Stem injection is very targeted and effective, and we've seen really good results, but obviously you do need to do follow-up treatment. Spraying is also an option, but it's more time specific, usually after you've done stem injection in following years. It is cheaper and quicker, but it is less targeted and can hit native species that are kicking around. Never, ever, 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 ever do manual control. The main reason we see Japanese knotweed spreading, in my example on the Tay, is through incorrect treatment, through strimming of Japanese knotweed, which just spreads plant fragments everywhere, washes them downstream. And we've seen huge areas be colonized purely due to the fact that people didn't know what it was. Like we were saying earlier, understand what you're dealing with. They strimmed it, they didn't know what they were dealing with, and they actually made the problem worse, which is a real shame. But once everyone knows what the right thing to do is, you can deal with Japanese knotweed very quickly. It is one of my favorite ones to deal with, but manual control is strictly off the table. Don't go near it. It just makes the problem worse. Here you can see the control we've been doing since 2018. So numbers of Japanese knotweed stems injected. We've been cracking through a fair few across the project area. There's obviously a lot within those numbers, but that gives you the sort of scale of what we're working on with the volunteers that we have. And as you can see with the picture there, some of my fantastic volunteers out on the river at Dunkeld. It wouldn't work without the volunteers. We're a volunteer-led project. We're just here to assist and provide the equipment and the expertise. It's people like them who are actually out there working with me, getting this done, and putting in these, frankly, just mind-blowing numbers. So it's a credit to everyone that's involved that we're able to be this effective out on our rivers. Just quickly, here you can see some evidence of control. On the left-hand side, we've got a site at Dunkeld, which we needed 32 hours of control and 7 litres of herbicide in 2019. I went back in 2020 and it took me 2 hours and I used 0.4 litres of herbicide. So you can see the humongous drop-off. We want to see that drop-off in chemical use because we don't want to use chemicals if we can avoid it. So where we are using chemicals, we want to use just the right amount and we want to see that use coming down, and that's exactly what we've seen. And then on the other side, again, we've gone from a reasonable amount of control to needing absolutely nothing in that case, which was absolutely brilliant. So, American skunk cabbage, introduced from North America. it's an emerging problem. We're finding more and more of it. The problem is it spreads by seed and rhizome, so it's got two areas that it can spread in, which make biosecurity a bit of a problem, especially if people don't know quite what they're dealing with. It grows on swampy, muddy areas, along watercourses, in wet woodlands. You'll see it on riverbanks, you'll see it up burns, that sort of stuff. And it does have a very strong smell, which is why it has its name. The impacts, again, it's more outcompeting, it's crowding out native biodiversity. It's creating an environmentally poor environment, a monoculture, which is not a healthy system. So we want to avoid that. And then on the sort of physical side, it's also potentially blocking drainage ditches and watercourses, which causes problems of its own. Control, we can't use stem injection. We do have to use foliar spray. So that's applying Roundup, glyphosate rather, to the leaves. That's optimal during May to July, and we find that's very, very effective, but multiple follow-up years are usually required because of the seed bank usually being established to a certain degree. If you can get it early and there's no seed bank, great, because it takes up to 3 years for a skunk cabbage to actually produce that first seed head on the plant. So if you can get it in year 1 or year 2, fantastic. But unfortunately, in many cases, we don't get there till it's too late. You can dig, but it's very, very difficult, and fragments could break off of the rhizome and you're then just spreading it around, which is an absolute nightmare. You can do it when the plants are small, but we wouldn't really recommend it again. And then as a sort of last case scenario, take the seed heads off at the very, very least. And at least you're not letting it spread more. You're keeping things how they are. Things aren't necessarily improving, but at least they aren't getting worse. And that's sort of the best case scenario if that's your only option. Here we've got some control up at Pitlochry we've been doing. So that's both the top photos. As you can see, we spent about 16 hours in this site. It was very boggy and difficult to get through. And that was in 2019. And in 2020, we then came back. We dropped our chemical use massively. And we still had to take a lot of time because the terrain was so difficult. But we did take less time. And you can see from the photos that the ecosystem is starting to look a bit more natural and a bit less alien, which is fantastic. So that's it from me right now. Obviously, I think we might have a bit of time for questions. I'm not sure. I'll ask Vicky about that. But no, thank you for listening, and really do pay attention to making sure that you're not rushing into things with invasive plant control. The temptation is just to sort of go charging in, but if you're controlled and organized, we find that actually you can have the much better results in the long run.
Great, thank you very much, Mark. If you want to take your screen down. We've had a couple of questions come in, and I think we'll maybe just take one question now and come back to the others at the end of the session.
Sure.
So in terms of, this is a great one, do you admit defeat? At what stage do you just have to concede defeat, as to no matter how much resource and effort you put in, things just keep coming back?
I mean, yeah, that's an interesting question. I think the first thing to understand is what I'd look in that situation is, why do things keep coming back? Where is the problem? We're doing all this effort. Why is the situation not improving? Because if there's a scenario like that would suggest that there is an alternate source that maybe we're not aware of, where if it's, say, hogweed, for example, seeds are washing down or appearing from somewhere else, and that's creating a situation where all the effort we're putting in just isn't improving the situation. It can be demoralizing if you've got a big seed bank, because you can go back every year and feel like, well, we spent days here last year, the situation hasn't improved, but you are working through that seed bank. And that's really important, because every single year you do it will pay off in the long run. So that would be my response to that. It might seem hopeless, but that probably means there's other problems at work there that you then need to identify. You maybe haven't identified the main site.
Another just really quick, interesting one here. What happens to the dead plants?
So in the case of Japanese knotweed, once you inject it, it just sort of dies off, rots away, and then you'll just be left with the stems. We tend to either trim them or just knock them over with sticks in the winter, and then that gives native species a chance to grow through in the spring and start to outcompete any knotweed that's remaining. And then in the case of the skunk cabbage, that just tends to sort of shrivel and rot away over time.
Thanks, Mark. I think we'll come back to the other questions at the end of the session. Yep. We've got plenty of time at the end, and we'll try and keep on track. Okay, so we'll hand over to Karen.
see that. So I'm Karen, I am the project officer based at the Devon, but I also cover the Isen and the Yugi catchments, and I'll be covering Himalayan Balsam, giant hogweed, and our sheep grazing trial today. So we'll jump right in with Himalayan Balsam, really pretty flower that was introduced to Kew Gardens and then really was mainly distributed by people passing seeds on. It spreads by seeds, it forms these ripe seed pods that can scatter seeds up to 7 meters, and it tends to really prefer growing in a sort of damp environment. So along riverbanks and damp woodlands is where it feels right at home. You can find out a little bit more in depth about this on our website at the ID guide. You've probably have noticed a pattern here for invasive species, plant species, that they shade and crowd out our native vegetation, reducing that biodiversity on the riverbanks. And in terms of Himalayan balsam, it is really, really attractive to pollinators. So it produces a lot of nectar, and quite often that means that other flowers, our native flowers around it, are actually left unpollinated, which obviously over time then exacerbates that problem. The shallow root systems, when it dies back in the winter, really provide no halt at all for the banks. So especially in high water events, that can quite often mean that banks are washed away, especially if it's monocultures of Himalayan balsam and there's nothing to stabilize it. And that obviously causes massive knock-on effects for our native fish and invertebrates by increased sediment loads going into the river. And it has a seed viability of about 2 years, which is actually pretty good news. So in terms of what we can actually do about it, Himalayan balsam is a brilliant one because everybody can do it. You don't need any specialized training or equipment. We've done this with primary school kids to people in retirement that just want to get out a little bit, meet people, be on the riverbank. And it's just a great way of getting outside, giving nature a helping hand, and also meeting new people. Whatever reason you might volunteer for, this is a really great one to get involved. All you need to do is, the shallow root systems are really saving grace here because you can pull up these plants pretty easily, pile them up like you can see down here at the bottom, and let them degrade on site. I would recommend, if you're pulling up, that you are piling them up just so these plants can't root back. These plants have nodes, just like Japanese knotweed or bamboo stems, and they can actually grow roots from their nodes. So sometimes in the summer, especially as it gets later, you will find that Himalayan balsam grows vertically along the ground, rerouting from the nodes, and then we'll shoot the flower head up. So optimal treatment for pulling is April to July. There is some other options in terms of mechanical control, like strimming, scything, or slashing. A word of caution here is that that works really, really well and is really time effective in areas where you've pretty much just got monocultures of Himalayan balsam. You can just scythe them down, let them degrade on site, but you need to be aware that if you are finding balsam is intermixed with other vegetation, that these methods are a lot less selective for native grasses and other species that might eventually even help outcompete other balsam coming up. So hand pulling in that case is definitely still preferable. Keep some of that biodiversity. But certainly an option, and certainly in the beginning when you've got big issues, a really time effective option. So the priorities with Himalayan balsam, like I've said, is they can grow roots from nodes. So if you're pulling, make sure that you actually get them up by the root and don't snap them off somewhere. Make sure that if you're cutting them, you're cutting them as low to the ground as possible, below the first node if possible, so that we can prevent what I've circled here in red, which is this regrowth that it stubbornly does when you snap them off or you don't cut them low enough. The other interesting one, I've got a little video here, is that obviously you should try and carry out any control before seed pods form. So if you pay attention to the hand here, you can see that this ripe seed pod with just a little touch then shoots these seeds out. So when they ripen, they will actually do that by themselves as well. I'm just going to show this video again for anybody that missed it. You just watch the hand, just the slightest little touch, and then they scatter up to 7 meters. So it gives you a pretty good idea of how well they actually spread. And these seeds are capable of floating as well. So that is how they spread downriver. Of course, plants don't tend to work to our schedules and priorities. So you will probably find at some point that you're working in areas where most of the Himalayan balsam is actually still flowering, but maybe some plants have already formed these seed heads and they've ripened. So if you're controlling in these areas, it's probably still worth it if you've got the majority of still flowering plants, but just make sure that you brush up your clothing, you clean under your shoes, and just make sure that you're not exacerbating the problem by carrying these seeds to new areas or spreading them further. I think in terms of our work with volunteers, this has been a really, really rewarding 3 years. In 2018, we started off with a pretty respectable 120 days of pulling Himalayan balsam with volunteers, really ramped that up in 2019 to 286. So you can imagine what we kind of achieved in that time. And then obviously due to COVID, we had to scale that down a little bit in 2020, but it's still great to see how many people came out for 43 days to still pull Himalayan balsam. And that's certainly an activity that we can do really safely, socially distanced out on the riverbank, and still do something good for nature in our areas. And certainly this is a plant that if you're out on a dog walk and you now recognize it and it's flowering, just grab a handful here and there and pull it out, and that makes all the difference. Many a mickle makes a muckle. I've got a nice site here where we've actually made a really good progress on the Yugi, where in 2019, which are the top pictures, me and the land manager spent 8 hours hacking away at Himalayan balsam. You can see all the pink in the pictures here, and pulling a bit more selectively between vegetation. And when I returned in 2020, I was able to massively reduce that time to just 3 hours and selectively pulling instead of having to use weed whackers. So that's been a really, really good success. And this is where it comes in, that seed viability of only 2 years and having some other vegetation that can help outcompete can make all the difference. And actually, I think this shows that we maybe even have a chance to make a good bit of progress here. In terms of giant hogweed, this is probably the plant you've all heard of or maybe have even seen. A really, really impressive plant. So it's no wonder really that it was introduced into gardens as a curiosity. They grow 2-3 meters high. My volunteer here in this picture is about 6 foot, so that gives you a pretty good idea of how large this giant hogweed was. Spreads really prolifically by seeds, 20 to 30,000 seeds per plant, and they've got quite longevity in the soil. They can survive for at least 3 years, in some conditions probably even longer. And again, it really prefers growing in near rivers or in rough pasture or in wasteland. Any of these areas you can find it. The one big thing about it is to have extreme caution when you come anywhere near this plant, because it does have a phototoxic sap, which causes skin burns when it reacts with direct sunlight. So certainly something that if you're controlling it, you should always wear full PPE and be extremely careful. And if you're just encountering it on the riverbank on a walk somewhere, then make a wide berth around it. So here the pattern comes in again. It forms really dense stands. It outcompetes everything native around it. So you can see that in this bottom picture here, where there isn't likely going to be much growing under these big leaves once we treat those. Again, the human health impacts it has due to the phototoxic sap. You can see a blister here that forms, and also it really has an impact on how we use our countryside recreationally, because if you're going to be faced by a big wall of giant hogweed near the river, then the chances are you're not going to be frolicking around along the river. Sorry. So the approach to how we deal with this species, absolutely our preferred method is foliar application, so spraying glyphosate onto the leaves. It's the safest and probably the most time effective and effective method, because you are in full PPE and you don't have to come too close with your extendable lances. You've got from April till about June to do this really effectively, but you do need qualifications when you're spraying in or near water. So that's something to definitely keep in mind. Other solutions for chemical control include stem injection and weed wiping. So just what Mark has just covered. Giant hogweed also has a hollow stem, so you can deliver a neat dose of herbicide directly into the stem and it will kill the plant, or you can wipe some neat herbicide onto the leaves. these methods can be really effective when you've got areas where you've only got sporadic plants. So you're not carrying 10, 15 liters on your back to treat 8 plants along a 1 kilometer stretch. But you do need qualifications for this once again, and you do want to make sure that you're highly competent, you've got the right training, you've got the right PPE, because it will require you to get closer to the plants than we would ideally like to. So spraying certainly is the preferred method. When time goes on in the summer and time gets away from you, and they start producing these really impressive flower heads, a big priority is to use long pole saws, so you don't have to get too close to start removing these flowering heads to prevent the seed source. So really useful for inaccessible plants, for example, as well, but big word of caution here is that you are releasing sap, and you do want to be very careful with that. And ideally, you definitely want to combine that with herbicide treatment. So once you've cut the flower down and the stem down, you want to deliver a bit of either neat or diluted herbicide into the hollow stem, and that will then also kill off the taproot. So they don't come back with a sort of emergency flower that they will put out that are usually smaller but will still produce seeds. So priority is preventing seeds. So this is definitely something to keep in mind. I've got a lovely little video of Jack here showing us how it's done, taking the flower head off first and then sawing much closer to the ground to make it less of a hazard. And at this moment, we would then also be delivering a little bit of herbicide into that stem. Digging is another option, but you should really only be doing this with small plants. So take your spade to take the leaves off first and then dig out that taproot, which you can see here. Looks a bit like a parsnip, and leave that above ground to dry out. But again, it very much depends on the terrain. It might work for very sporadic plants, or if you really don't want to use chemical, but we don't really recommend it. It also very much depends on how much of a glutton for punishment you are, because it's not the easiest, and it's time consuming. And if there's other options, they should certainly be preferable to that. So just to drive that point home, priority is absolutely to prevent any seeds going down. So if you have to walk past any first and second year plants to get to that flowering head, that should be your priority. You can get the first and second year plants next year. They're not going to go anywhere. They're not going to go to flower. But what you want to be doing if you're faced with a scenario like this, you want to focus on everything that has a white flower head. And of course, as always, practice good biosecurity. Don't be part of that problem. Clean yourself off, clean your shoes off, clean your car off if necessary, so that we're not spreading these seeds into other areas. Now, these numbers, I think, are absolutely incredible. We are here talking about the length of river in kilometers that is currently under management by SISI. So in 2018, we started off with, again, a very respectable 639 kilometers, ramped that up in 2019 to 760, which is the equivalent distance from London to Inverness in a straight line, just to visualize that. And then in 2020, we did have some difficulties due to COVID because we couldn't get out to do it. We couldn't work with too many volunteers. But what happened here is actually we didn't take a massive hit at all, because our land managers really stepped it up and stepped in when it was necessary and controlled on their land. So actually, we didn't take much of a hit at all. And I think it just merits a massive thank you to all the volunteers, all the land managers, all the gillies, everybody that we've worked with that have made this such a huge success for us so far. We've got a nice little example here. This is Ingle Maldi, and you can see in the top pictures that is the situation that we found in 2019. A lovely monoculture of giant hogweed that took 20 hours to control and 7 liters of neat herbicide. And then when we came back in 2020, it looked much better. So we actually spent a lot less time, only 8 hours, and we only needed 0.7 liters of neat herbicide to treat any remaining hogweed plants there. Now, we shouldn't go celebrating just yet, because the seed bank means that there will always be more popping up. With us having removed all of these hogweed plants, also, if you look at the bottom pictures, we have also likely very much prepared this ground perfectly for germination of hogweed seedlings. So we can fully expect that when we come back to this place this year, that we'll probably be using a bit more time and more herbicide again. And that is just unfortunately the case with giant hogweed. We need to go back to these areas. We need to make sure that we get it every year until that seed bank is depleted. But it's nice to see that chemical use is going down, and it's nice to see that in certain areas also time control is going down, because we can then focus these hours in other areas and make more progress, as long as we make sure that we revisit these areas year on year. So it is quite likely that we're going to plateau at some point in terms of herbicide and in terms of hours needed. But if we can get that initial herbicide use down and also reduce our hours that we're actually spending controlling this, then that is already nice progress. And that brings us to a really interesting trial that we've been running on the Devon as part of our work. So flocking to the rescue have been our sheep that are grazing the giant hogweed. So what we would generally like to know is, can land managers use sheep to control giant hogweed? So through that, we would like to establish the optimal grazing regime, and we would like to produce a guidance document at the end of our trial in 2021, so that we can hopefully advise other land managers of how they could use sheep successfully to do this. If you want to find out a bit more about this, then you can go to our website, where the link is down here, and read about our case study, which we will be updating regularly as well. So this came about, this trial at the Macduff trial site came about in 2019. It's a mature woodland strip. It's kind of wedged between the River Devon and some arable land, and there's a number of streams running through that site into the Devon. So quite nice conditions for giant hogweed. It also has a path running through it, so it's quite a popular recreational route, and that obviously then introduces the public health concerns again. And as you can see from this picture, we've got a pretty healthy giant hogweed infestation in this area. Previous chemical control, because of the terrain, because of the density of this infestation, has been ineffective, has been time consuming and expensive. So the farmer was actually really, really happy to try and give the sheep trial a shot. And so enter the humble sheep. So I've got a nice trial cam video here of our site, where you can see the sheep tackling some hogweed over a number of days. So the first thing that we can say with some confidence is that sheep quite happily eat giant hogweed. But the other thing to remember is that they're not miracle workers. So it has apparently no ill effect to them. And we've been looking at that with veterinary care in a previous trial, but they're not miracle workers. We've talked about how giant hogweed takes about 3 to 5 years to actually store up enough energy in its taproot, send out a flower, and then go to seed and then die. So actually what these sheep are doing here is they're just continuously working by grazing down these leaves to deplete that energy in the taproot. The exception to this is small seedlings that haven't had any time to store up energy yet. But for these larger plants, certainly the taproot will be sending more energy up and there will be new leaves forming. So this is a multi-year process, not only because the sheep are working to deplete that energy, but also because of that seed bank that will have already built up in the soil. So because of that, it is really important that we do some monitoring. We do that with our academic partner, which is the University of Aberdeen, and we're looking through monitoring at the grazing impact on the volume of giant hogweed across the site and the grazing impact on the rest of the vegetation. So if you have a look at the top right here, you can see our trial site, this woodland strip, and the blue little circles are our giant hogweed monitoring plots, and the orange dots are our vegetation monitoring plots. And I've got a nice little example here at the bottom where we've taken 2 pictures of the same plot in 2019, one in June, where you can see a lot of hogweed, and then one in the beginning of October after the sheep had been on site. And then in 2020, we've repeated the same plot. So you can see some seedlings coming back up in that area in June, and then what it looks like in September after the sheep had been on site and had come off. What we have found so far, and keeping in mind that we are still in the middle of our trial, so we're still learning, we're still adjusting, is that in 2019, we had the sheep on for just over 5,000 total sheep grazing days. And what we found is that the sheep very effectively munched down on the giant hogweed and controlled that. But what we also found was pretty significant overgrazing impacts on other vegetation. So in 2020, we adjusted this and about halved our sheep grazing days on site. And what we found is that the sheep still really effectively tackled the giant hogweed problem, and that we also reduced our overgrazing impacts on other vegetation, but some was still occurring. So we have to adjust that further. So for this year in 2021, we're looking at putting roughly 1,500 total sheep grazing days on the site. The absolute takeaway from this is that even when we're decreasing sheep grazing pressure, the giant hogweed is still being tackled really, really effectively, but we're reducing our overgrazing impacts, or best case scenario, we're avoiding them entirely. We have found that overgrazing alters vegetation structure and composition really long term. So we'll have in areas where the level of grazing is too high, you'll have really well defended and palatable species moving in, quite often nitrogen loving ones from the sheep dung that we're putting on the site, obviously. So things like nettles and thistles will start moving in. And what we're also then finding is that not only does that kind of decrease the biodiversity and alter that structure and composition, but also it makes the grazing of giant hogweed less effective, because the sheep are quite reluctant to whack themselves in amongst these nettles and thistles to graze the giant hogweed in there. So the takeaway from that absolutely is that initial undergrazing is much preferable to overgrazing. We can always adjust our grazing pressure so that we can cater to effective hogweed grazing, but not so much grazing that it causes overgrazing of other species. And the other thing we have learned, really nicely demonstrated by our sheep here in this trail cam video, is that sheep will actually quite happily tackle larger hogweed plants. So in that case, actually our priority is not that as hogweed emerges early in the spring, the sheep need to go on site. We can absolutely put them on a little bit later, and they will still graze these bigger plants. We've even observed on our site that sheep will kind of rub up against these big flowering plants and knock them over and then graze them down. So quite impressive, maybe not what we were expected, but the one thing that we do probably expect is that you can still see flowering plants in the background here. So we're right back to sheep aren't miracle workers. It will always take some maintenance and some mop up from us. So to go onto that site at the right time to cut down these flowering plants so that we're absolutely preventing any seeds being added to that already existing seed bank. So we're not making the problem worse, and we're just slowly working year on year to actually make this problem much, much better. So like I said, you can find more information and updated case studies that we're doing year on year on our website. So do go there and have a look. And other than that, I would be happy to take some questions.
Thanks, Karen. I think most of the questions that have been coming in, we might save to the end because they've been more general about landowners and responsibilities and where the project's working, as opposed to specifically anything that's come up about balsam or hogweed. Unless anyone wants to fire a quick question to Karen now, specifically on hogweed or balsam or something she's mentioned. Otherwise, I think we'll move on and save those longer questions for the end.
Sounds good to me.
There's one about, we'll come back to herbicide, I think, an obvious one. What does neat herbicide refer to? A pure glyphosate solution not mixed with water. I think that was actually Mark's talk where he mentioned neat herbicide, which is what we use in the stem injectors. As
Neat herbicide is
diluted.
Yeah, neat herbicide is just straight injected sort of from the bottle into the stem injector, into the plant, whereas for stuff like hogweed and American skunk cabbage, you're diluting it with water in a backpack sprayer and then applying it. But obviously we count all chemical that we've applied, we log the neat chemical we've used on that side, whether we're stem injecting it or spraying it.
Here's one for Karen. What breed of sheep?
So we certainly started this off. So generally speaking, breeds with darker pigmentation that are hairier are probably preferable. We started off with black-faced sheep, but we've actually not found any problems with other breeds either. So for us at least, we've not had any ill effects to these sheep. So potentially it doesn't have to be black-faced sheep.
Great, thanks Karen. Okay, we'll hand over to Callum now, who's going to talk about the Mink project.
Okay, hopefully that's up on your screen now. My job is to talk about a little bit about how we are approaching our Mink control project and what's involved in that. The previous presentations have talked about our plant control work and given you a flavour as to how we've progressed that. And this talk's now going to cover our only animal in our hit list, the American mink. Much of this information will probably be known to you already, but minks are voracious and effective predator. It will eat basically whatever it can lay its grubby little paws on, but particularly targets water voles, ground nesting birds, which are vulnerable to its habits. Semi-aquatic, so it can both in water and on the bank side. And that makes species such as water voles particularly vulnerable. American mink is a widespread animal, but present at low population densities. So, though it's widespread, it appears in pockets and not in huge numbers in any particular location, which makes it different from other control projects such as the grey squirrel scheme, where they remove many, many hundreds of animals, and we're at an order of magnitude less than that, but we'll cover that in a little minute. They're also fantastic colonizers. I mean, common to most invasive species, they are very good at finding new homes and establishing themselves. And this animal has two specific seasonal migration periods where it will travel long distance to take up breeding territories. One migration period is right now. So we have mink on the move seeking breeding territories and breeding partners with a view to reproducing in the next couple of months. And then after the breeding season in the late summer, so July, August, September, we then have a second migration where the young of the year are distributing to find new territories for the following season. And also there are many animals and many species that when density becomes low, reproductive success becomes higher. So the more you try to remove them, the more they try to reproduce more effectively. So it makes it difficult and challenging to be effective here, but let us tell you about how we've approached it. I'm hoping that slide's going to move on, but it's not. Okay, this is a map showing the distribution of mink in 1967 and also then in 2010. And in Scotland, the animal spread from early introductions, and there's a wee timeline there on the left. First farms in the UK, 1929, first farms in Scotland, 1938, and the last farm in Scotland, 1993, and the practice of fur farming in the UK banned in 2000, and then in Scotland in 2002. And what's kind of obvious from those figures is that fur farming completed and ended, but the mink movement and migration and extension continued. We had escapes on an ongoing basis from when fur farming started, but once that practice was ended, mink were already established in the wild and were able to expand their territories and expand their coverage in Scotland. I mentioned seasonally more. They will average a dispersal of 20 kilometres in seeking a new territory once they leave the young breeding site. But 20% of these animals will move more than 80 kilometres to find new breeding territories, and that makes it particularly challenging. So the map on the right is a part of a genetic study that we completed with the University of Aberdeen previously, and that shows the interrelatedness genetically by animals caught in different locations. So you can see that those lines are connecting animals who are genetically related. And what that shows is that animals that perhaps breed in one location then pop up in very many different locations and often some distance away, which really means that you've kind of got to be targeting mink control on a strategic and large scale. Otherwise, you remove an animal from one location and it is simply replaced in another. We mentioned earlier on the breeding and the migration periods, and the little map at the little graph at the bottom, sorry, shows the periods where we catch the animals that we have been removing from 2018 onwards. And you can see a peak in the spring from about now, which then falls away in May, June, and then begins to rise again in July onwards, where the young of the year are captured. So we have a period in the winter time and also again in the summertime where the animals are less active or less outwardly active and mobile, and therefore less catchable. So they give us some challenges by their resilience and by their effectiveness as a populator and a spreader. So how do we approach this problem? We have two means of doing this. We have a network of volunteers who are helping us to monitor for the presence of mink. And that's a reasonably straightforward process. We have volunteers such as young Amelia here on the left, who adopts a mink raft. You can see the mink raft at her feet. That's a very simple floating structure with a clay pad underneath that tunnel. And mink are encouraged to jump raft, scurry through the tunnel, and very helpfully leave their footprints on the clay, which you can see in the middle image. And when we know that mink are in the neighbourhood, we then return to that raft and set a trap. And then hopefully we keep our fingers crossed and hope that the animal returns and is inquisitive enough again to do us the honour of jumping in the trap. And we do that across the board. This is Ali, who's one of our intrepid volunteers at Tay Marshes, just outside Perth. And we capture mink live. And we also have the apparatus on the right-hand side, which is called Mink Police. So there's a strict legal obligations when you're actually trapping any animal in the wild. And that requires the trap to be monitored at least once in every 24-hour period to ensure appropriate animal welfare conditions are maintained. In some areas that is straightforward. If we have a volunteer or a member of staff or a project member who's close by or is working in the area, and a daily check is straightforward. In other locations, that's less easy, and we use this Mink Police to allow us to be informed or advised when the trap is triggered. So what that does, it's an automated signal on the cage, and our staff member would receive a text or an email notification when the trap is sprung, and therefore we can go and visit the trap and remove the mink. And that removes the obligation to check on a daily basis, because that's an accepted method of surveillance of the trap. So we monitor first for the presence of mink, and thereafter, when we know mink are in the neighbourhood, we set the trap and seek to remove them. We have a number of people who are in working locations, perhaps, who prefer just to run traps on a continual and ongoing basis, and that's perfectly fine by us as long as they're able to meet the legal obligations of inspection. We're using live capture traps. In mainland Scotland, there are a number of other little creatures and critters that are out there that sometimes take an interest in these. We have polecats on the bottom left, we have otters bottom right, pine marten top right, a little albino ferret on the middle, and of course our target, public enemy number 1, American mink, bottom middle. And that allows us to select the animals that are entering the trap and release any non-target species, and at the same time ensure that we dispatch only mink. It's fair to say we don't catch many of these other animals, but when we do, we clearly like to be able to release them. So how do we approach this problem? We're trying to control mink on a large scale across a third of mainland Scotland, and it's a big patch to cover. But we have some knowledge about mink and their habitats and their ecology and where they like to be and where they would probably prefer not to be. In general, they don't like to be on mountaintops, and in general, they don't like to be on bogs and wetlands. They much more prefer productive food areas along the coast or in agricultural improved areas. And that means that's where we should be thinking that we're likely to find these animals and where we should target our efforts. And if you look at the map on the right, it's generally the green areas on that map would be matching up to these sort of habitats, lower level agricultural areas, not wetland, not bogs. So how do we get on and how have we approached this? The SISI Mink Control Project is not the first mink control project that there has ever been. I've been involved in predecessor projects to this, the Scottish Mink Initiative and others before to that. And what these maps are showing is essentially where we have detected mink over previous studies. So this is 2006 to 2015, and the map on your left shows where we have found monitoring rafts with mink footprints detected. And you can see clusters of red, the darker red showing the more abundant detections. And you can see clusters of those across that duration, 26 to 2015. And remarkably, following those sort of habitats in that map previously, the green areas, along the coast, in agricultural areas, and actually following some of the river catchments you can see on the Tay particularly, and the Ness. And then when you look at the detection section, the detection of mink in the final year of the scheme, this scheme anyway, July 14 to 15, you can see that there's a much reduced distribution of attendance and a distribution of detection rather. So they're still in these sort of predictable hotspot areas, but they're significantly less abundant. And you can see some areas in Murray where the animals and along Speyside, etc., have almost no longer been detected in that project. We've got a similar figure in terms of where we've caught creature in those schemes, 26 to 2015. Again, the map on the left showing the total frequency of all the captures over all those schemes, and the darker red showing the intensity of captures. And you can see they follow the detection maps, as we saw a second ago, and the same sort of hotspot areas showing up very clearly here. But again, when you look at the capture locations in the last 12 months of this scheme, 2014 to 2015, firstly, very much fewer numbers, as you would expect, because that's just a single year as opposed to 8 to 9 years of capture. But the intensity of capture is reduced, and the distribution of those capture sites is much restricted. So that gave us something to, if you like, to go on when we rebooted the SISI project and looked to initially restart the mink control scheme. So now, talking about we've been, a map on the right is essentially a distribution of our combined draft and trap locations 2018, 2019. There are a few additional sites in 2020, but essentially that network is as and we have a maximum number of traps of 245 and a maximum number of rafts of 428. And they're described as maximum figures because clearly we switch between the two depending when and if mink are detected. And we can see how those numbers have changed over the 2018 to 2020 period, and also the absolute reliance we have on volunteers to help maintain that network, increasing year on year, and actually even increasing in the COVID year of last year, where people found they were more than happy to get involved in this scheme, were able to do so under their allowable daily exercise regime and the stay at home and keep local guidance that we were all operating under. So we're really pleased that we've got that sort of network up and in place and showing, and we're delighted that we're able to do that in collaboration with so many volunteers who have been a fantastic an essential requirement to the scheme. So that's all well and good. That's never where do we catch them in the current scheme? And again, it's those same maximum traps, maximum rafts. But when you look at actual 72 capture locations, giving 368 animals removed over 3 years. So that means that approximately 2/3 of that raft and trap network have never encountered a mink so far. But it's important that we maintain that wide network, because they have also allow us to confirm that the animals aren't present, which is just as important as finding that they are, and also to allow us to pick up any animals that decide to get their skates on and migrate significant distances seeking new territories. So we're absolutely relying on those volunteers remaining vigilant and diligent with the project, because though they may be catching and detecting no mink themselves, they're playing a really fundamental and important part and role in the scheme to help us continue to assess how effective our control is being. But not all sites are equal. And there are definitely hotspots. So when you begin distribution of locations where we've captured but one mink, we look at this map, and there are 94 of those sites out of the total 172 locations, and 94 sites with single mink gives us 94 mink. But actually there's a much smaller number of sites where we catch more of the animals. So when you look at capture sites with 2 to 4 captures of mink, we're down to 59 locations only, giving us 41% of the total animals removed. And there's still a fair number, but that's 59 sites out of a total coverage of perhaps 600 locations. But even more than that, when you look at the real places that we have got to be, where we are capturing 5 or more mink since we've started, there are 19 of those hotspots, and they're removing 124 animals. So 11% of the total locations, of capture locations, gives us 34% of the total mink. So we have very, very clearly defined hotspot areas that we have simply got to cover in order to deliver any sort of modicum of control on this animal. And when you begin to combine all those sort of stats and figures, that of approximately the 600 raft and trap locations, we're actually capturing, and the 368 captures, we've got a very small number of locations, 19 in fact, sorry, I can't see that number, but we've got a very small number of locations that are giving us a large number of the animals removed. So, you know, if we are not in those sites, those 78 sites, we miss 75% of the mink. And reciprocally, it means that if we were really forced to batten down the hatches and reduce our effort, we could set a very much reduced network of sites and still be confident of removing up to 3/4 of the animals that we catch at the moment with a full network. So I've said it once and I will say it again, you know, these are the anchors, but also related to the volunteer hours that are donated to the scheme. Volunteers come in all sorts of shapes and forms, and every single one of them is fundamentally important to the mink control effort. It simply would not be possible to run that sort of network at that sort of scale and to deliver that sort of time contribution on a staffed basis. It's just not affordable as the way the world turns at this particular point in time. And in total, those volunteers have given 50,320 hours to the Mink project alone. That's not counting anything to do with plant work. It's a staggering contribution and we're always hugely grateful of it. So what can we be learning about control at this sort of scale? Well, a number of real fundamentals. You've got to understand a little bit about the biology and the ecology of the animal. And similar to Mark's talk right at the beginning about understanding your plant and your species and what controls it and when it reproduces, we need to have that sort of understanding about the mink. And we do know where they like to be, and we do know that they like to disperse and have huge dispersal potential, which means we've got to control at a large scale. Controlling mink at local scale will do nothing other than clear out mink at a local point and leave the territory open for recolonisation. So it's really important to try and go on a scale which is large and strategic, but to do that, you've got to really engage a large number of people in that network. Settled female mink are important. Clearly, these are the breeding animals, but those animals are restricted to a very small proportion of the landscape and a select number of locations, essentially the prime breeding spots and locations. And as shown by the capture, we know pretty much where those hotspots are, and that means these are the priority sites for us to be active on in terms of covering the network with rafts and traps. Removing the juvenile mink is important, and certainly in the autumn and the summer of each year, there's a large number of animals that are produced, and that's an ideal opportunity for us to capture as many of those as we possibly can before they disperse, settle in for the winter and prepare themselves for breeding in the spring. So again, dispersal in the autumn period is important that we are ready and prepared for that. That's because they can help depress the population numbers. And actually the practicalities of such a scheme, because it is something which is challenging, it takes a little bit of thinking and coordination, and really has been informed hugely by the contribution of our academic partner, University of Aberdeen, who've been fundamental in helping to help frame the previous mink control work and this one. And Xavier Lambin, who I don't think is on this call, but it's made a massive contribution to the project in terms of his expertise and an ongoing challenge, let's say, of us as public bodies and of a project to always do better. But what can we learn of this? Well, you can control mink on a large scale, but funding, as ever, is always a problem, and that's been an issue that's been raised. I've seen in some of the earlier questions on plant control, you know, who's paying for the control, how can we control on a large scale? It's essential that ongoing support is in place. When you have gaps in funding, new project names, new logos, new badges, new staff, the mink aren't really interested, to be honest, and nor are the volunteers. And I think that sometimes when people are involved in projects, they often forget that the people that are helping those projects function are the volunteers. So it's really key that where we, as best we can, we plan ahead, we try and secure funding before the other money runs out to allow us to maintain that relationship. Mink control is absolutely acceptable. I've been involved in this for a number of years now in different guises and different organisations and projects, and it's very rarely that a friend of the mink makes himself known. So it is socially acceptable. It seems to be the one animal that seems to have very few friends at court, but maintaining control on such a large scale is very difficult and challenging. It needs commitment. As a project team, it needs commitment from our partners, and it needs commitment and enthusiasm of our partners and our staff towards the volunteers who we rely upon. And it needs also requirement for others, the land management organisations, to be part of this. That there are a number of organisations that own significant tracts of land in Scotland, and really for us to expect or secure volunteer engagement and support, we've really got to make sure that those land managers, the estates, the conservation organisations are all lined up too, because clearly very difficult for us individuals to help when they don't see the big boys and girls contributing. But also I think the real final takeaway message is that really this control work at this scale simply can't happen without volunteer contribution and effort, and it's something that we genuinely appreciate and want to thank everyone who's involved in it. Again, for their contributions. And I think that is the line. It is free. So if there are questions, we prepare them. And of course, I think as we move on to the final presentation about volunteering, we're always open for new volunteers and participants in the scheme. We'll mail that message, I'm sure, final presentation this afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks, Callum. We've not actually had any questions specifically about mink, so I might just crack on and talk about volunteering, and then we can finish on time. There's been quite a few other questions come in that we have got a note of, so we'll come back at the end and we'll stay online as long as anybody wants to chat through some of these other questions. So just a quick chat for me to finish with about volunteering, because volunteering is at the heart of our project. We have many volunteers involved in our project, and we're grateful to all of them. As Callum said, we can't keep thanking them enough. They come from all walks of life, have completely different reasons for getting involved in volunteering. Some of our volunteers do it purely to get outdoors. Some do it because they appreciate the countryside. Some do it because they have that responsibility as a land manager or a landowner. Some do it because they want to give something back specifically to their community in the area when they live. But whatever motivations, we're just grateful for everybody's contribution, whether it's a small one or a large one. It doesn't matter, and we're super happy to have everyone on board. We have been able to work with significant numbers of volunteers through the project so far. You can see mink volunteers and plant volunteers there. And it's quite useful, I think, just to note that, because when you're looking after mink raft and you're just one person checking your mink raft every week, thinking, you know, nothing's come on my mink raft, nothing's happening, is this worth it? When you think you're part of a huge team of 357 people out there who are all looking after mink rafts, then yeah, you're part of something bigger, and it really is worth it. And together we can make a difference, as Callum said, with some of the monitoring work that is ongoing. Now, in terms of the actual aims of our project, the way this initiative is working is aiming to kind of put together community-based invasive species management. So the work that our project officers have been doing is very much about supporting volunteers, working with community groups. We've been able to fund a lot of people to put them through their pesticide qualifications. To date, that's 111 people. We've got another 12 booked on a course next week. And that's about building capacity in the communities so that when our project finishes, because it's a limited time project, that there's going to be people in the community who hopefully have been enthused and engaged and understand the species and the control required and have that skills to carry it on. And like some of the pictures Mark and Karen have shown you, we've already brought quite a few plants down into what we could describe as a maintenance state. So they just need checking on every year and small populations controlling. And so hopefully we're hoping now that invasive species control is now embedded at a local level, and the local angling club or individual volunteers will continue that when the project is over. In terms of the contribution all these wonderful volunteers have made already during the time of our project, it has been massively significant. Like Callum's just mentioned, 50,000 volunteer hours put into the mink control project and over 15,000 hours into the plant control project. Together that makes a massive 65,000 odd volunteer hours, which equates to 9,000 volunteer days. These numbers don't mean anything, but if you translate that into staff time, that would equate to 44 people working on our project, and that is pretty significant. So the volunteer effort that has been put back into our project is really quite amazing. But it's not just a numbers game, it's about the difference on the ground. You've seen a lot of slides already showing the difference that the effort can make in terms of opening up rivers, allowing access to the river, allowing to see the views. We've seen the trap networks, the raft and trap networks. I mean, there's no way we could run we could run a raft network on that sort of scale without the support of all those volunteers. And the impacts we don't see are the impacts that moving mink are having. The main predator on waterfoals and ground nesting birds. And we don't tend to go for a walk and suddenly see a fantastic 30 or 40 number of waterfoals. We established a colony because we've removed mink, but it is happening out there, and that's because of the work on the mink project and the work of our volunteers. So you should give yourselves a pat on the back for that. A little nod to what happened last year in 2020, when obviously COVID impacted the project massively. You might look at these graphs and think, oh, yikes, the number of volunteers just disappeared and the work disappeared. But we looked at these graphs and we went, wow, 200 people still came out last year. That's unbelievable, considering we didn't go out ourselves and start work till June or July, and then we were only working with one volunteer or two volunteers. This is the effort that's been put back in by the landowners, by the people we've trained with their pesticide certificates. They've gone out and carried on. This is the effort by community groups who we pulled balsam with the year before and who took the initiative, some individuals, some small groups, to go out on their own and re-pull balsam the second year. And the same happened with the mink project, as Callum alluded to. When we went into lockdown last year, come March, we were at 400 rafts and 150 odd traps. When the lockdown happened, we were told to stay at home, we were told not to leave our houses. We contacted all our mink volunteers and we said, look, just put everything on hold, just stop the project. Over 200 people ignored us, which is just fantastic. And we had all these lovely messages saying, oh no, I used my daily exercise to check on my raft. And lovely stories saying, you know, it made me feel worthwhile. It made me feel like I was a part of something and I was still doing some good and I was contributing to something, which for us was just fantastic. And it meant we also kept this monitoring network in place. And more significantly, when we hit July and August, we actually restored the trapping network and the monitoring network to significant levels. As Callum mentioned, this period in July, August, September is key trapping time for mink. So by the time we'd come out of lockdown, we were actually at a higher level in terms of the number of traps out than when we went in. So we managed not to have an impact on the mink populations, managed to get it back under control again. And I think that gives us a little bit of hope in terms of what might happen when the project's gone, as the way people hopefully will carry on anyway, and carry on with the control work, even if the project staff aren't here to support that. The final little bit of our project work that we do, the guys aren't out there all the time controlling plants. We do put quite a bit of effort into education work and raising awareness and understanding. So we're out doing, in the days when we could, walks and talks and chat to people at game fairs when we had things like that, and we put out a lot of information. And just a nod, somebody's asked about school groups and whether we're putting this online. We do work with schools, and during lockdown last year we made best use of our time and we wrote an online educational resource pack called Alien Detectives. So if any of you do work with schools, primary schools, secondary schools, community groups, scouts, anything like that, we'd urge you to go online. It's completely free, everything is there to download. We've done all the hard work for you. There's presentations there, there's games, there's invasive species top trump cards, anything you could possibly want to help you teach other people about invasive species. So please do use those resources. So I think really just to finish, our going away message today would be really that everyone can help halt invasive species spread. So whether you get directly involved in control work as a volunteer, whether you just change your habits, you practice better biosecurity, or whether you're just aware yourself or tell other people about invasive species and their impacts and take the time to report a plant or mink sighting. We've had a couple of questions about reporting. All these topics here are on our website, invasivespecies.scot. So if you want to know, you can use our online reporting form and report things to us, or there's a page on our website about reporting as to which council or roads authority or else that you need to report something to. And as I've just mentioned, all those educational resources are on the website as well. So I think final message is just thank you to everybody who's been involved in our project and everybody out there who is going to hopefully get involved in the future. So thank you all very much, and we hope you've enjoyed listening today, and we'll wrap up with any more questions.
Okay, Vicky, there's a few questions coming in. I think probably, don't know if you want to coordinate them as the sort of mastermind of this event.
Draw breath first.
Aye, okay, I'll just have a wee look, see if there's anything obvious from now.
There's a couple to pick up from before. So one for Karen, giant hogweed. How long does the seed bank remain viable, and is it critical to remove the root rather than just severing it?
So the seed bank is an interesting one. It's certainly 3 years, certainly in some conditions, maybe not all of the seeds, but some seeds will remain viable for probably a few years longer. So that is definitely a control effort. That will be 7 to 10 years, I would estimate, to be on the safe side. In terms of the root, so if you're applying herbicide, whether that is stem injection, weed wiping, or spraying, that is transported into the root, so it will kill that off. If you are cutting it, that is why we're advising to also combine that with chemical control, so that the cut stem will still take that herbicide up and will transport it to the root and kill it. And if you're digging, you are taking the tap root out. So if you're leaving that above ground to dry out, then that should be the plant also dead. That answers the question.
Yeah. There's a couple come in there about communities and volunteering, so I'll just take those while you're looking through the rest. Which community groups engage with SISI in the Nairn catchment? FNLRT, the Findhorn Nairn and Lossy Rivers Trust are one of our partners. The other group we work with quite a lot is Nairn Wild Things, who've been out and done quite a lot of Himalayan balsam pulling work with us, which is fantastic. Is it possible to see if people issued with community service orders can work on these projects? Yes, they can. We've worked with the community payback teams. Mark and Karen are both nodding because they both work with teams in Aberdeen, down in Tay.
Yeah, it's mixed success. I would say it's definitely something worth trying, and it has worked, like Vicky said, in some areas. I've tried it in Angus and Perthshire, however, and it's crashed and burned horribly. And more often than not, it's because the areas of the council that are handling this are massively under-resourced and just don't have the facilities sometimes to even get the people out to where they'd be able to come and work with us, which is a real shame, because we see people coming out when we were able to do it, really getting a lot out of it. And it was actually a very positive experience for everyone involved, but it is very, very difficult. And in some cases, you're maybe only getting them out once or twice a year, and that's it. So to have it as a regular organized thing, very, very hard.
I've actually had the opposite experience, in that tens of hours were put in by community payback teams to pull Himalayan balsam, especially after just one session with me. The supervisors were really confident going out and doing that on their own, but we've also had them building mink rafts for us, as we've been for the more kind of workshop based.
Interesting. It's good to know.
Specific one there. Are there waterfalls in Pitlochry area?
Not that I'm aware of. Unfortunately, it's not fantastic habitat for them anyway. There could be, but we've not seen any waterfall tracks on our monitoring stations that we've got in the area, and we don't see a lot of mink up there either, actually. So if they are there, hopefully there's not a lot of mink eating them.
Callum, do you want to take this one? Do you know if hogweed is being managed at the mouth of the D below RGU? I see hogweed on the train. Does the railway line spread the seeds?
All right, okay. I'll try not to mention Network Rail too often here. The easy answer to the question is, I don't think it will be being managed. The River Dee Trust or the Fishery Board are a partner with hogweed and other species further upstream. So they are targeting work upstream, and hopefully we'll get down to those sort of locations when we've dealt with the problem elsewhere. But I think if anyone's familiar with rivers such as the Uri at Inverurie, you'll realise how massive a problem they've got. It's an industrial scale hogweed farm at that location. And the answer about the rail network, the answer is yes, they possibly do and can spread hogweed. So we've got a priority list of sites into Network Rail with a view to trying to get them to engage in and control hogweed infestations on their estate, particularly where they intersect with our programmes of work. So Mark's got sites on the Esk, there are others on Spey and the Findhorn. And again, it's trying to prioritise where we get them to work to best effect. I think that's been a theme through quite a lot of the questions I've seen coming in, that, I think Danny's question right at the beginning about when is it too big and when do you just give up before you start? Well, I think the whole answer to that is you've got to scope how big the problem is before you start, and see if you've got the resources to actually make a difference to it. I think invasive plant control everywhere is littered with projects that have started with the best intentions, but have never had the resources or the duration to see it through, or they've not heard Mark for, if you like, and they've jumped in and tried to control in the place it's not going to be effective. So it is an absolute challenge and a battle to do that. But I think the answer to the question on the D is no, we're not actively controlling there, and yes, we are working with Network Rail, and yes, networks of transport links such as rail and road can help spread invasive species.
There's another one here you might want to take, Callum or anybody. Do you deal with white butterbur? There's several stretches on the riverbank at Perth growing in monocultures. We all know the answer to that one.
Okay.
Yeah, again, it's something we're not targeting specifically, because our two main target species, based on what was achievable on the Tay, where we're working, are Japanese knotweed and giant hogweed. We think in the 4+1 year that we've got available, we think we can get those species into a position where ideally between sort of Loch Tay and Loch Rannoch all the way down to maybe Stanley, we can get the situation under control. But we're not focusing on on white butterbur unless we happen to come across it. I know it is down in the Perth area, but again, that's out of our control area at this time. Same as the hogweed. I get people telling me about the hogweed. Unfortunately, we have to deal with the upstream sources.
I think, Mark, probably important to recognise that white butterbur is within the programme of the project. So there's a white butterbur control trial that we're running on Speyside, because it was one of the species where there wasn't really a clearly defined recommended approach for control. So we've got some sites up on Speyside where we're investigating the methods and techniques of control and how would we best tackle that problem. So that's been looking at, you know, different concentrations of chemical treatment, whether we can shade them out by tree planting, whether we can dig them out or rotate them away. And rather perhaps not surprisingly, we're finding thus far that they can best be controlled by herbicide application, digging them out as a back breaks to kind of mimic Karen's sheep approach. But at the minute, we're not controlling white butterbur extensively, but we are looking to bring forward, like from the project, some advice as to how butterbur should and could be controlled best going forward.
Yeah, we've got a question here about the SISI project being extended, that this must be for the long haul to treat species. And volunteers always need encouragement and support, and new recruits brought in. And I think that is something we would definitely agree with. We've only got funding guaranteed till the end of 2021. And as Callan referred to, we are pretty sure we're going to get an extension year. But I think everybody on this call today will all be nodding, going, yes, the model set up was to test if we could embed it within the community and not and set it up during these 4 years. But we all know personally that without our support at a local level, volunteering will drop off, and volunteers need our support, need our assistance. So I think we'd agree definitely with that comment from Sally there. We are working with fishery trusts right across our project area, so there is always going to be a local organisation in place, but whether they have the capacity to support the volunteers as much as the support's coming through project officers is unlikely, and I think we would fight the case that long term. Yes, this would be great if we could continue supporting volunteers. I think the other guys are nodding away, would agree with that.
Yeah.
I guess the answer is we would say that, wouldn't we? So I think though that what the project's about is, I feel, almost like to prove the principle that this sort of model can work and can be effective, because there's nothing new in putting a chemical that's designed to kill plants on a plant and the response is the plant dies. We know that. What the project is about isn't demonstrating simply that, it's demonstrating that if and when we invest in communities by paying for expensive training courses, supporting people, supporting community volunteers, that I feel like the effort that can be generated through that support becomes very cost effective as a model for control. And I think that's kind of what we are now looking and focusing on in the final 18 months of the projects. I think the extension will happen, and we need to begin to demonstrate that this model is an effective one and one that could be extended. There's been questions up on the board about, you know, extending the project. The questioner is right. You know, if we walk away, then eventually things will dwindle and decline. And we don't want to walk away. We want to support the people that have made the commitment to this project, because, you know, those commitments are valuable and we don't want to waste them. So yeah, our intention is to be working in the next 18 months to build that capacity, as I think Peter's asked there in the final question, and also to you know, demonstrate that this model is one that should and could be funded going forward.
Yeah, there's another one just come in there about white butterbur, asking, we've got it in Dunkeld, is there any information on the website about it and other species? Yes, there is a page on our website about white butterbur with a link to a good blog post that James has wrote, and a case study which we are just updating the results of at the moment. So there is information there, and you'll notice it is out of date, but we are in the process of updating it. So yes, isn't any information about piri piri. That's not one that our project specifically is dealing with, but the Northeast Group, or the website we mentioned right at the beginning, the GBNNSS, the non-native species.org, they have information about piri piri and any other species on their website.
We were planning on doing some white butterbur control in Dunkeld with NTS. Unfortunately, then NTS got rid of all of their staff. So that's kind of set back our strategy in the Dunkeld area for the white butterbur. However, the Japanese knotweed situation is still being managed and is being reduced every year. There's also, unfortunately, a massively out of control Himalayan knotweed problem in the Dunkeld area too. So those are the two we're focused on. Like I say, there was a plan to deal with the white butterbur with the staff members we trained up with NTS, but they both got let go, and it's just me by myself and some local fishermen again. So we're kind of trying to sort of see if we can fit that in this coming year.
Good question that was asked almost right at the beginning of the presentations. What will you use if and when glyphosate can no longer be used? Surprised more hasn't come up about that one.
Right, okay. I'll make a stab at this because there isn't an obvious answer. The honest answer is there is no obvious alternative to glyphosate. And we're acutely aware of the legal proceedings in the States, and we've looked at those and continue to track those. The situation just now is that glyphosate remains approved and safe to use in Europe, and appreciating that we are somewhat tenuous link to Europe now, also in the UK. And therefore,
had a quick look at that to clarify. Yeah. It remains legal in the EU till 2022, so end of December 2022. And the legislation that brought us out of Europe has automatically extended that by 3 years, so it can be used in the UK till 2025.
Yeah. So we're going to continue to use it, but clearly we're very mindful of the concerns that are being raised from those cases in the States. They sort of protect all our staff and volunteers appropriately with the PPE, and they're all trained and supervised to make sure that they're not doing anything which, you know, is inappropriate chemical use. But the answer is that there is no obvious alternative chemical for use, and that's going to be a real problem if that situation of legal use is changed. Hence the reason we're exploring options such as Karen's sheep, for example. But to be honest, that's not going to be a mechanism or an option that's going to be widely applicable. So I think if glyphosate was to come off the market and that option be removed, I think all control programs like this would be in a bit of trouble, significant difficulty and significantly limit.
I mean, there's emerging technology coming up. I mean, I attended a demonstration of electronic control, so actually electrocuting the plants earlier in this year in February. That's being used a lot in the Netherlands right now, but unfortunately the technology is very early stages and it's not very scalable. So what we're seeing is there is potential stuff in the pipework, but I think until it's scalable and we're able to train up volunteers and use it for this kind of model, it could be another 10 years kind of thing. Because I mean, the one I looked at, you have to have a generator on the back of a 4x4 that you then have to drive up and down with your equipment attached to it. And it's tens, I think it was something like 25,000–30,000 pounds per piece of equipment. So that's just not feasible right now. But hopefully as technology improves, it's something that we will start to see these alternative methods of control coming and helping us phase out chemical and maybe completely get rid of chemical control in at some point down the line.
We had quite a few questions come in dotted through the whole session that are on the same sort of theme about legislation and landowners. How is legislation enforced against landowners? Are landowners not funding this work? Is it not a statutory responsibility for them? Hogweed's not restricted to riverbanks. What is being done to control the plant in other areas? So I don't know if between you know, Callum, we can kind of sum up on slightly without getting into logistics and the legislation in depth.
Yeah, I think there's been two or three answers. There's been 2 or 3 answers given directly in the chat box about that, shown to where there's summaries of the legal positions and trying to set out, you know, the obligations of the landowners. Essentially, the landowners have obligations not to control on their land, but to prevent the spread from their land. And there's also deep frustrations by that, because the limit that really gives when landowners aren't minded to undertake control. Nature Scot has powers to oblige control, but clearly they're going to prioritise where they enforce those powers to where it's most essential and needed and where the impact is most significant. And they would always prefer to use their powers of persuasion to try and get landowners to engage and support that work. We've adopted a similar sort of approach. We're not here to, if you like, bail out groups who are unwilling to help themselves. So we've tried to be much more pragmatic than that and support landowners to train their staff, to work alongside them, to deliver control on their land and to bring the problem down to a manageable scale so that they can maintain that control. But it is an ongoing challenge. The links on the chat are legislation and also where you can report the presence of plants, and I know some to our own websites and some to national recording points. So if you've got anything else you want to put on top of that, Vicky, because it is an issue that comes up often for us, and it can be a point of frustration.
The link again in the comment in the chat box to the summary we wrote on the law about it, so that's there if anybody wants to read a bit more. But I think the legislation is geared around stopping new things coming in and stopping spread, as opposed to trying to eradicate and remove things.
Yeah.
There's no specific questions come in, but I think that is generally it on most of the topics. If we've missed anything, there's quite a few people still left on the call, do repost if you've got anything or we've missed your question. We had one, this is we're going to real challenge you all. Any advice about bamboo control? Had it planted under beech, which was expected to shade it out, but the plants are still rather in rude health. Anybody dealt with bamboo?
My garden, dig it out. Dig it out, chop it up, take it to the composting site, the local authority. I like to say, Vicky, I think probably I can see the numbers on the attendance at the minute, beginning slide, and I think we've probably dealt with most of the major questions. So what I was going to suggest is that we've obviously got a record of the questions and stuff that are posted, and if there's anything that's kind of outstanding, we'll come back to you directly, and the presentations, etc., are going to be posted up on the website, so you'll be able to revisit this joyous afternoon all over again if you wish to. But it's just to say thank you very much to everyone who's taken the time out today to join us. We appreciate you coming along. From my perspective, also, I thank the team SISI who've had to put up with me trying to knock these presentations into some standardised shape, and particularly to Vicky Hilton, who's coordinated this and made it all happen with us today. So it means we thank the team for thanking everyone for coming along, and to wish you all a very pleasant rest of your afternoon. And you can contact us directly via our website, as the details that Vicky put up. If you have any further questions or comments or wish to get involved with us, then do get in touch and we will get back to you as quickly as we can. Other than that, just says thank you very much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.